You have not eaten in 14 hours, and somewhere inside your body a switch is about to flip, a switch that has nothing to do with willpower and everything to do with physics. Energy does not disappear when you stop eating, it changes form. It moves from one system to another. And the moment your stored fuel starts running low, your cells make a decision that has been hardwired into biology for millions of years, a decision to stop building and start repairing. Most people think fasting is only about losing weight, about a smaller number on a scale, but that idea barely scratches the surface of what is actually happening. What is really happening is a full-scale redistribution of energy, according to rules that look a lot more like thermodynamics than nutrition. And once you understand those rules, the reason fasting repairs so much more than your metabolism stops sounding like a trend and starts sounding like something closer to engineering. Before I go further, if the way your body actually works is something you care about, this is exactly the kind of thing smart psychology tries to explain clearly. So if you want more of this, staying subscribed means you will not miss the next one. Let us start with the basic physics of the situation, because everything else builds from here. Your body runs on a simple accounting system: energy in, energy stored, energy out. When you eat, glucose floods your bloodstream, insulin rises to shuttle that glucose into cells and into storage, and your body enters what scientists call the fed state, a state built entirely around building things, storing fat, storing glycogen, synthesizing new proteins. This is a state of net construction. But construction requires raw materials and it requires energy, and in a closed system, you cannot build indefinitely without also degrading, because the second law of thermodynamics does not take breaks. Every system that only builds and never clears out its own waste eventually clogs itself with the byproducts of that building: damaged proteins, malfunctioning cell parts, oxidative debris. Your body is not an exception to this law, it is a demonstration of it. And this is where fasting becomes relevant, because fasting is the condition under which your body flips from construction mode into a very different mode, a clearance and repair mode, and the switch between these two states is governed by remarkably precise molecular sensors. The first sensor worth understanding is called AMPK, adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase, and you can think of it as your cell's internal energy gauge. When your glycogen reserves start dropping, usually somewhere between 10 and 16 hours after your last meal, the ratio of AMP to ATP inside your cells begins to shift, and AMPK detects that shift the way a fuel gauge detects an empty tank. Once AMPK activates, it does something remarkable. It suppresses a second molecule called mTOR, mechanistic target of rapamycin, which is the master switch for growth and construction. mTOR is what tells your cells to keep building new proteins, keep growing, keep expanding, and as long as mTOR stays active, your cells never prioritize cleanup. Because from a purely energetic standpoint, building and repairing compete for the same resources, and a cell cannot do both at full capacity at the same time. When AMPK rises and mTOR falls, your cells receive a very specific instruction: stop expanding, start recycling what you already have. This is not a metaphor, it is a literal chemical handoff, and it is one of the most conserved biological mechanisms across nearly every living organism on the planet, from yeast to worms to mice to humans. That recycling process has a name, autophagy, which translates roughly to self-eating, and in 2016 a Japanese biologist named Yoshinori Osumi won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, specifically for mapping out how this process works at the genetic level. What Osumi discovered is that cells contain small double-membrane structures called autophagosomes, and when autophagy is triggered, these structures essentially go hunting inside the cell, engulfing damaged proteins, malfunctioning mitochondria, and misfolded molecular debris that has been accumulating, and then delivering that material to the lysosome, a compartment filled with enzymes that break the debris down into its basic components: amino acids, fatty acids, sugars. Those basic components are not discarded, they are recycled directly back into the cell to be used as building material or as emergency fuel. Here is the part that connects directly back to physics. This entire process only becomes energetically favorable to your cells once the constant supply of new incoming nutrients stops. As long as you are eating regularly, your body has no urgent reason to break down old material when new material keeps arriving. It is only when the external energy supply pauses that the internal economy shifts toward using what it already has stored inside itself. And that shift is what triggers deep repair at the cellular level. This is also why fasting produces such a distinct hormonal signature, one that looks almost opposite to the fed state. Insulin drops significantly, often falling to some of its lowest levels of the entire day, and as insulin falls, a hormone called glucagon rises to take over, signaling the liver to release stored glucose, and then once glycogen reserves run low, to begin producing ketone bodies from fat. But insulin and glucagon are not the only hormones responding to this shift. Growth hormone rises as well, and this is one of the more striking findings in the fasting research literature. A study led by physician Mark Hartman and colleagues, published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism in 1992, found that growth hormone secretion increased roughly 5-fold in men after about 2 days of fasting, and later research has consistently supported the idea that shorter fasting windows produce a smaller but still meaningful rise in growth hormone as well. Growth hormone matters here because it is one of the primary signaling molecules involved in tissue repair, in preserving lean muscle mass during periods of low food intake, and in mobilizing fat for energy so that your body can protect protein stores rather than break down muscle tissue for fuel. In other words, at the exact moment your body has the least incoming energy, it raises the hormone most responsible for protecting and repairing its existing structure, which from a purely physics-based lens looks like a system reallocating its limited resources toward maintenance rather than expansion, precisely because expansion is no longer sustainable given the current energy input. There is also a circadian dimension to this that most people never think about, because your metabolism does not run at the same efficiency around the clock. It follows a daily rhythm shaped by light exposure, sleep timing, and the pattern of when energy typically arrives. Sachin Panda, a circadian biologist at the Salk Institute, has spent much of his career studying what he calls time-restricted feeding, and his research, along with a series of human pilot studies published in the journal Cell Metabolism, found that compressing food intake into a consistent window of roughly 8 to 10 hours each day, without necessarily reducing total calories, improved markers like blood pressure, insulin sensitivity, and oxidative stress in participants over just a few weeks. The mechanism behind this connects directly back to the physics framing. Your liver, your pancreas, and your fat tissue all contain their own internal molecular clocks, and those clocks expect a period of fasting overnight, followed by a defined feeding window during the day, the same way a factory expects scheduled downtime for maintenance, rather than running every machine continuously without pause. When eating is spread randomly across 16 or 18 hours a day, snacks late at night, coffee with sugar first thing in the morning, food arriving at inconsistent intervals, those internal clocks receive a confusing, constantly shifting signal, and the repair processes we have been discussing, autophagy, mitophagy, the migrating motor complex, never get a clean, predictable window in which to operate at full strength. If this is starting to reframe how you think about skipping a meal, that reframing is exactly the goal here, and it is worth telling a friend who thinks fasting is just about hunger, because there is a real mechanism behind it, and hitting like on this video helps more people actually see that mechanism explained. Now let us go deeper into the mitochondria, because this is where the repair story becomes even more interesting from an engineering standpoint. Mitochondria are the structures inside your cells responsible for converting nutrients into usable energy, and like any machine that runs constantly, they accumulate wear over time, oxidative damage, structural inefficiency, reduced output. Under normal continuous feeding conditions, damaged mitochondria tend to stick around longer than they should, because again, there is no strong signal telling the cell to prioritize clearing them out. But fasting activates a process called mitophagy, which is essentially autophagy specifically targeted at mitochondria, selectively identifying the least efficient, most damaged mitochondria and breaking them down. At the same time, fasting activates a protein called PGC1 alpha, a master regulator of what scientists call mitochondrial biogenesis, the process of building new, more efficient mitochondria to replace the ones that were just cleared out. So you get a two-part cycle: damaged units removed, fresh units built, and repeated cycles of this pattern over weeks and months produce a cellular energy system that is measurably more efficient than one that never experiences this kind of periodic stress. This pattern actually mirrors a concept well known in physics and engineering called hormesis, The idea that a system exposed to mild, controlled, intermittent stress often becomes stronger and more resilient than a system that is never stressed at all, and also stronger than a system that is stressed too much or too continuously. Think about how a muscle adapts to resistance training. Tiny amounts of structural damage during the workout, followed by a repair period during rest, actually produce a stronger muscle than either constant strain or constant rest ever could. Fasting appears to apply this exact same principle at the cellular and mitochondrial level, a mild temporary energy deficit that the body interprets not as a crisis but as a signal to upgrade its internal machinery, and that upgrade only happens because the system was allowed to experience scarcity in the first place. A cell that is fed constantly, minute to minute, hour to hour, day after day, never receives the signal required to initiate that upgrade cycle, because from the cell perspective, there is simply no reason to improve efficiency when energy keeps arriving without interruption. There is another layer to this story that involves ketone bodies directly, beyond simply serving as fuel. When your liver converts fat into ketones during a fasting state, the primary ketone produced, beta-hydroxybutyrate, does something that surprised researchers when it was first documented. A study led by immunologist Yu-Su Yum and published in Nature Medicine in 2015 showed that beta-hydroxybutyrate directly inhibits a structure inside immune cells called the NLRP3 inflammasome, a molecular complex responsible for triggering chronic low-grade inflammation throughout the body. This means that ketone production during fasting is not just an alternative fuel source for your brain and muscles. It is also functioning as a signaling molecule that actively dampens certain inflammatory pathways, and chronic inflammation is one of the shared underlying mechanisms connected to a wide range of long-term health conditions. Your brain in particular benefits from this shift because, unlike most other tissues, your brain can run efficiently on ketones when glucose becomes scarce, and neuroscientist Mark Mattson, who spent decades studying intermittent fasting at the National Institute on Aging, has published extensive research showing that intermittent energy restriction increases levels of a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which supports the growth of new neural connections and appears to protect existing neurons against several forms of cellular stress. There is one more repair process worth understanding, and it happens not inside individual cells, but across your entire digestive tract. Between meals, once your stomach and small intestine have fully emptied, a pattern of strong, sweeping muscular contractions begins traveling through your gastrointestinal system, a pattern researchers call the migrating motor complex. This housekeeping wave, first mapped in detail by gastroenterologist Jerry Van Trappen in the 1970s, functions essentially like a maintenance crew, sweeping leftover food particles, dead cells, and bacterial overgrowth down through the digestive tract, keeping the small intestine clear of the kind of buildup that can otherwise become chronic gut irritation over time. Here is the critical detail: the migrating motor complex only activates during genuine fasting periods, and it shuts down the moment new food enters your stomach. If you are eating every 2 or 3 hours throughout the day, snacking constantly, sipping calorie-containing drinks between meals, this cleaning wave essentially never gets the chance to run its full cycle, which means your gut never receives its own dedicated repair window, in exactly the same way your cells never receive theirs when they are fed without pause. There is one more finding worth including here, because it pushes this idea beyond individual cells and into entire systems of the body regenerating themselves. In 2014, a research team led by Chengxia Wei, working in the laboratory of Walter Longo at the University of Southern California, published a study in the journal Cell Stem Cell, showing that cycles of prolonged fasting, roughly 2 to 4 days at a time, reduced levels of an enzyme called protein kinase A in blood-forming stem cells, and that reduction appeared to shift those stem cells out of a dormant state and into an active regenerative mode. In both mice and a small human trial involving cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy, prolonged fasting cycles were associated with the regeneration of white blood cell populations that had been depleted, essentially reflecting what the researchers described as a partial system reboot of part of the immune system. This is an extreme version of the same underlying physics principle running throughout everything discussed so far. When energy input drops low enough for long enough, the body does not simply endure the shortage passively, It treats the shortage as a signal to clear out old, potentially damaged cellular populations and rebuild fresher ones in their place, prioritizing long-term structural integrity over short-term convenience, exactly the trade-off you would expect from a well-engineered system operating under conservation of energy. Put all of these mechanisms together, and a coherent picture starts to form, one governed by a fairly simple physics principle. A system cannot fully repair itself while it is simultaneously being asked to grow, and growth requires a continuous input of raw material, while repair requires a temporary pause in that input so existing structures can be broken down, sorted, and rebuilt. Fasting does not add anything new to your body. It does not introduce some special repair compound. What it actually does is remove the constant construction signal long enough for your existing repair systems, autophagy, mitophagy, growth hormone-mediated tissue maintenance, ketone-driven anti-inflammatory signaling, and the gut-migrating motor complex to finally get uninterrupted time to operate. It also helps to step back for a moment and look at this whole process through the lens of the second law of thermodynamics directly, because that law states that any closed system, left alone, naturally moves toward greater disorder over time, more entropy, more disorganization, unless energy is deliberately directed toward maintaining structure. Your body is not a closed system. It constantly exchanges energy and matter with its environment. But at the cellular level, every single one of your roughly 37 trillion cells is fighting the exact same battle against entropy every single day. Proteins misfold, membranes oxidize, mitochondrial DNA accumulates small mutations, and without a dedicated process to identify and correct that disorder, it accumulates the way rust accumulates on unmaintained metal. Autophagy, metophagy, and the hormonal shifts triggered by fasting are essentially your body-directed anti-entropy machinery. And like any maintenance process, that machinery needs a window of time when it is not competing with the ongoing demands of digestion, nutrient storage, and growth signaling. A continuously fed system spends nearly all of its available energy budget on those competing demands, leaving very little dedicated capacity for cleanup, while a system that experiences a regular, predictable pause in feeding temporarily redirects a meaningful share of that energy budget toward exactly the anti-entropy processes we have spent this whole video walking through. None of this means fasting is appropriate for everyone in every circumstance, and this is worth saying clearly. People managing diabetes, people who are pregnant, people with a history of disordered eating, and people taking medications that require food should talk with a doctor before changing their eating pattern. Because the same mechanisms that repair a healthy system can create real problems in a body that is already under different kinds of stress. Most of the research behind these mechanisms involves daily fasting windows in the range of 12 to 16 hours overnight, which for most healthy adults simply means finishing dinner reasonably early and delaying breakfast slightly. Not extreme multi-day fasting, and even that modest window appears to be enough to activate several of the pathways described here. It is also worth mentioning that the longer, multi-day fasting protocols involved in some of the more dramatic stem cell and immune regeneration research were conducted under medical supervision, often alongside patients already undergoing structured clinical treatment, and are not something to attempt casually without guidance. Because the same energy scarcity that triggers beneficial repair signaling can become genuinely harmful if it is prolonged without proper hydration, electrolyte support, and monitoring. The version of this that is realistic and well supported for most healthy adults living ordinary lives is far less dramatic than a multi-day water fast. It usually looks like an early dinner, a slightly delayed breakfast, and a consistent overnight window free of snacking, which is a small adjustment with a surprisingly large physiological signal attached to it. It is worth also connecting this back to the hormesis idea one more time before closing, because that framework really is the cleanest way to hold all of these separate mechanisms in your head at once. A system pushed with zero stress atrophies, a system pushed with constant, unrelenting stress breaks down, and a system pushed with brief, repeated, recoverable stress adapts and strengthens, and this pattern shows up everywhere in biology and physics. From bone density responding to mechanical load, to the immune system responding to controlled exposure, to muscle fibers responding to resistance training. Fasting simply applies that same universal pattern to your metabolic and cellular maintenance systems. A brief, predictable, recoverable dip in incoming energy that your body has been engineered across an evolutionary timescale to interpret not as danger, but as an invitation to clean house, and every mechanism covered in this video, the AMPK and mTOR switch, autophagy, mitophagy, the growth hormone response, ketone signaling, the circadian feeding clock, the migrating motor complex, and even stem cell regeneration under more extreme protocols, is really just one underlying pattern expressed across many different systems of your body at once. What I find genuinely remarkable about all of this is how it reframes something that looks like restriction into something that is actually closer to permission for a repair system that has been running in the background of your biology for your entire life to finally do the job it was built to do uninterrupted. Your body was never waiting for a new supplement or a new diet trend. It was waiting for a pause, and that pause is the entire mechanism, not a side effect of it. If understanding the actual machinery behind your own body, rather than just the surface-level advice, is something you want more of, subscribing to this channel means the next explanation like this one lands directly in front of you when it comes out. And if a friend or family member has ever asked you why fasting seems to help with more than just weight, sending them this explanation might answer that question better than you could in a quick conversation. The physics of it is simple, even when the biology looks complicated. Energy stops, repair begins, and that has been true in your body since long before anyone gave it a name.